You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Good morning. Today is August 25th, 2022. I am Peter Betke. I am the director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at George Mason University and a professor in the economics department here at George Mason. And I'm thrilled to be here today to have this discussion of Erwin Decker's new book, relatively new book, on Jan Tinbergen and the rise of economic expertise. Erwin, I'm really excited, is here as he's a senior fellow in our Hayek program with me. That's after 10 years of working at Erasmus University. Erwin is the author of a fantastic book on the students of civilization. And then he is now the author of this new book, which if I was on camera, I guess I would show it. Yep. Let me see. Yep. Here, this new book, which is an award-winning book. Congratulations to Erwin for that. And we're here with a great panel to have a conversation about that. We have Michaela Alkovich, who is a professor at University of Bologna, is the author of a fantastic biography on Albert Hirschman, as well as a book on the political economy of the World Bank. He's going to go first and give his remarks. And then we have Sandra Pert, who is the dean at Jepson School of Leadership at University of Richmond. She is also the author of several fantastic works, as well as being president of the Adam Smith Society and the History of Economic Society. And I will just mention, not only, her fantastic little book on the essential John Stuart Mill, but also this amazing book on Towards an Economics of Natural Equals, which she published with David Levy with Cambridge as well. So I'm going to get out of the way. I will turn it over to Michaela. You go first, and then Sandra, you just come in right after he's done, and then Erwin. Erwin, you give some opening remarks first, right? Is that right? Yeah, I apologize for that. So Erwin, you have, give your opening remarks, then we'll go to Michaela, then Sandra, and then back to Erwin, and then open it up for a conversation among all of us. Okay, so Erwin, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Pete. So today I want to say something about my intellectual biography of Jan Tinbergen. The book traces the upbringing in The Hague to his later work on peace economics, but today I don't intend to give a full overview of his life or work, but rather to present one of the two key arguments that runs through the book, namely that Tinbergen's work should be understood as a contribution to what the Germans call Staatswissenschaften, or in plain English, economics as a science, or better, an instrument for state governance. This is not how the first Nobel Prize winner in economics is typically remembered. He won alongside the Norwegian Ragnar Frisch for their work on the analysis of economic fluctuations. In other words, models of the business cycle. For Tinbergen, the prize is directly connected to his pioneering macroeconometric model, which he developed and estimated for the Dutch economy in 1936, and then a few years later for the US economy. Frisch and Tinbergen are further remembered as pioneers of econometrics and founding members of the Econometric Society in the 1930s, and therefore associated with both the mathematization of economics as well as the more recent empirical turn in economics generally and macroeconomics specifically. This pioneering role in empirical studies of the macroeconomy is a good entry point to start my argument why Tinbergen's work changed the way that governments manage the economy much more than that it changed the way economics is done. His career started at the Dutch Bureau of Statistics, where Tinbergen worked until 1945. So the first 17 years of his professional career were spent not mainly at a university, but at a statistical bureau. He was involved in efforts to standardize measures of GDP, unemployment, and various other macro statistics and industrial measures. This was an international effort which happened in various European countries as well as the US, partly at the initiative of the League of Nations, where Tinbergen would construct his model of the US economy in the late 1930s. The construction of standardized measures of the economy were a key input for the later macroeconomic models and for the type of quantitative economic policy which Tinbergen came to favor. The adoption of standard measures of GDP was also, for instance, a precondition for the reception of Marshall aid after the Second World War, of which the Netherlands received the most of all countries in per capita terms. So it was immediately tied up with state aid and interventions in the economy. It is important to emphasize that such statistical efforts were not new, right? They had been around for a couple of centuries even, but they specifically took off at the German Historical School in the late 19th century, who really played a pioneering role in this idea to control and get a grip on the economy through statistics. And macroeconomic indicators developed very quickly during the 1920s and 30s when, for instance, index numbers, GDP figures, and business cycle barometers were constructed. This drive for quantification was intimately tied up with the desire to get a better grip and more control over the economy. And interestingly, in Tinbergen's case, the inspiration for doing so did not mainly come from earlier attempts at state planning or even wartime planning, as it did for some other economists. It in fact came from business planning or management planning. So he was particularly impressed by Fordism and Taylorism and other new management techniques which used quantification to plan within the firm. He spoke of the rationalization which had happened in industry while government was lagging behind, and he saw his efforts at the Bureau of Statistics as an attempt to rationalize government policy. The historian should always be wary of great claims about the new or revolutions, but something fundamentally altered, I think, in the 1930s and 40s about what the scope of rational economic planning and management of the economy could achieve. That story can be told as an ideological battle between communism and capitalism, I think a favorite sort of narrative, but the story of Tinbergen is that of the middle, of a social democrat who, after a very brief radical period, in his youth wanted to couple socialist goals with rational economic management in a European social democratic fashion. That story is less dramatic. In the preface, I joke that I have essentially written the biography of a bureaucrat, which is not very attractive or dramatic, but it is very informative, I believe, about state building in the 20th century. After Tinbergen left the Bureau of Statistics, he became the founding director of the Central Planning Bureau in the Netherlands. This institute was somewhat oddly named, for they never actually attempted central planning. What they did do was to use Tinbergen's most important innovation for governing the economy, so-called decision models. The models of the 1930s, for which he received the Nobel Prize and which made him famous, sought to explain the dynamics of the economy, but they actually provided very little guidance on how policy might alter these dynamics. They were essentially analytic and descriptive models, not models to steer the economy. They relied on the assumption that policy was given or exogenous. In the decision models that he constructed in the 1950s, there were instrument variables, such as the interest rate, tax rates, or government expenditure, and for a while, even the wage rate, which was centrally set in the Netherlands. Policymakers could use these instruments to manipulate certain target variables, such as the unemployment rate, the GDP level, as well as income levels. The idea of instruments or levers which can be used to steer the economy is often associated with Keynesian macro management of the economy. I don't think there's anything wrong with that idea, but putting all of this on Keynes, I think, does tend to obscure a lot, because Keynes essentially provided a sort of ideology to do this, but he provided very little of the concrete tools or thought about the institutes which might implement such measures, in part because Keynes had such a direct line to government, whereas, as I said, Tinbergen was much more the bureaucrat than the economic expert and engineer. So these institutional changes meant that there were new organizations such as the statistical bureaus and planning agencies, but also a nationalized central bank which controlled the interest rate, and sometimes corporatist organizations where unions, employers, and the state met to set um, key policies such as the wage rate. Tinbergen also realized it required a new type of economics training in which the emphasis moved away from the books and economic history to a combination of mathematical skill and a deep sense of social responsibility and social concerns, right? So he also wasn't a pure technocrat in the sense that he only thought about technical methods. He actually saw these people as socially aware and socially responsible governors of the economy. Those working at the new organizations would be the economic experts, of which I think Tinbergen is a kind of exemplary type. He was exemplary precisely because he not only pioneered the technical tools, which was important, but even more so because he made this new form of management possible through his sort of entrepreneurial role in setting up these institutes. He and his students developed and helped found some of the key organizations and provided a home and a place of influence for these policy experts. In the book, I show, for instance, how the Dutch Central Planning Bureau functioned as a model for the state planning organization in Turkey. In a comparative study of planning methods from the early 1950s, Tinbergen sent out surveys to 51 similar national organizations which did this type of economic planning on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Meanwhile, his student Koos Polak played an important role in shaping the research agenda at the IMF and played a key role in setting up the modern global economic indicators. In my reading, this combination of the systematic collection of statistics and the founding of institutes which use these as an input to plan or steer the economy should be seen as a new form of state building and international governance. This is also evident from the fact that Tinbergen realized that the rise of expertise and the establishment of these new organizations required a rethinking of democracy. Tinbergen was very willing to do this and was open about it. In the 1930s, he agreed with the critics of parliamentary democracy, which had failed to act in the face of big crisis, he argued. And he added that nearly all members of parliament were, in fact, ignorant when it came to economic matters. So his push for expert institutions was explicitly an argument to move economic policy away from parliament and into the hands of technocrats like him. He suggested that this might have the additional benefit of getting rid of the short-term concerns of politicians. Again, context here is important, right? Tinbergen was not the only critic of parliamentary democracy in the 1930s. Of course, the fascists are famous for pushing for strong political leaders who would essentially replace parliamentary discussions. There were corporatist alternatives who wanted to organize the state along the lines of economic interest groups, elements of which can also be found in Tinbergen's work. There were ordo-liberal proposals to strengthen the rule of law and to limit the scope of what governments were allowed to do. And there were those like Tinbergen who hoped that a superior form of economic governance could be achieved by giving more decision power to experts, working for the national government, often in semi-autonomous institutes. Depending on one's perspective, this might have been one of the lesser evils in the context of the 1930s. But an evil it turned out to be. This is not so well recognized at the domestic level. Some still long back for the activist macroeconomic management of the post-war decades. But even they will acknowledge that economic experts have not always pursued this type of policy and have sometimes, for example, enforced top-down austerity on countries or domestically, as we witnessed in the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008. There are others who cheer on the demise of this Keynesian macro management and who favor the technocratic neoliberalism of the 1990s, sometimes called the Washington Consensus, which they consider a major improvement and an almost necessary consequence of the failure of Keynesian macro management. But the truth is that both policy agendas are rooted in the same conception of economic expertise and the way that the state governs the economy. The disagreement is over the effectiveness of different policy tools, not over the desirability of this top-down steering of the economy by non-elected experts, or the effectiveness in general of technical tools to govern a complex society. It is interesting that this is so different outside of the domestic policy arena, where I think the limits of this approach are much better recognized. When Tinbergen felt that he had largely completed his project in the Netherlands in the mid 1950s, he turned to development economics, international economics. Tinbergen worked for organizations like the United Nations, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the OECD in countries around the world from Indonesia to Turkey and South and Middle America. Many of his students, and there were a lot of them, think of dozens, stayed for longer periods of time abroad as development experts. They were sent along with engineers, water experts, and doctors from the West to underdeveloped countries to engineer economic development. In the mid 1950s, planning became the dominant approach, and so, in a kind of ironic twist of events, the West sent socialist inspired economic planners to the rest of the world to prevent the further spread of communism. In my case study of Tinbergen's work in Turkey, I demonstrate in detail how such an intervention worked. In Turkey, political turmoil, in this case a military coup, was supported by the West, after which a favorable climate for Western experts was created who were meant to modernize the economy from above. Tinbergen came in right at the time of this coup and convinced the military interim government to establish this state planning organization and to give it a lot of power. In Indonesia, Tinbergen was sent in after Sukarno's government crumbled, not long after Sukarno had turned against Western aid with the famous word F your aid. Afterwards, General Suharto seized the opportunity to oppress the left wing opposition, as well as people associated with China, again with military aid from the West. General Suharto led a bloody campaign, sometimes called the Indonesian Genocide, which is now estimated to have killed between 500,000 and 1.2 million citizens. It was hoped that Tinbergen's advice to Suharto, the new leader, would help stabilize the Indonesian economy and legitimize the new government. The contested nature of the enterprise cannot have been lost on Tinbergen, who was greeted by major student protests at the airport when he arrived. It is well established that early development economics was ineffective and increased economic inequalities, but it was the political economic side, I think, that was more harmful in the long run. It legitimized or perhaps normalized outside interventions in the underdeveloped countries, often former colonies and newly independent countries. It makes clear that the most fundamental weakness of economics as an instrument of state governance. It becomes complicit in whatever goals governments decide to pursue. This jeopardizes the integrity of economics as a science. One of his students explained to me that Tinbergen did not want to see any publications on the widespread corruption and abuse of international aid that development countries received, the famous golden badge in Africa, for instance, afraid that it might lower the levels of aid that existed. But more importantly, it undermines the role that economic science can play as a critique of those in power, because it has become an instrument of this power. Not to mention that it makes all social problems look like problems of state governance. This is very much what happened in development economics, which has since been rightly criticized for its neo-colonial aspirations, its entanglement with Cold War politics, and its statist top-down approach. That Tinbergen, in his own work, got caught up in these development projects that went against his pacifist and socialist convictions. He, for example, refused the draft, should be a warning to all of us. This is the man who was described by Paul Samuelson as a humanist saint, who was welcomed at Haverford College in Massachusetts as a natural Quaker. Even Keynes, in his biting critique of Tinbergen's econometric model, could not fault his moral character. No one is more frank, more painstaking, more free from subjective bias than Professor Tinbergen. There is no one, therefore, so far as human qualities go, whom it would be safer to trust with black magic. The fault, therefore, was not in the moral character of Tinbergen, about who I also failed to discover any moral scandals or juicy details, aside perhaps from the fact that he proudly never owned a car and bragged about it, but greatly enjoyed being driven around and had a private chauffeur. Nor did it have something to do with his political convictions. Tinbergen, in fact, opposed NATO for not being sufficiently international and too much an instrument for Western power politics. And his concern with the poor was genuine, as I illustrate in many passages of the book. The fault must therefore be with the stuff itself, the black magic. The danger lies in the approach and the institutional position of economic expertise that Tinbergen envisioned. His own career is again exemplary. Tinbergen did not become full professor until 1954, when he was 51. And even then, it was to trade in his position to work as expert for Dutch government to that of an expert for international organization, not to gain more critical academic distance from policy and political power. He, in fact, became more ambitious as his career grew about the role that experts should play, especially in global politics. A check on such power was hardly ever discussed in his work. Sandy Peart and David Levy have done much in their work to uncover the troubled relationship between expertise and democracy. In her inauguration as Erasmus Fellow in London, Deirdre McCloskey last year spoke of the age of policy and what it entails. The age of policy of our masters taxing, subsidizing, nudging, regulating, protecting, penalizing, and jailing us, with expert guidance from the economists and calculators, needs to end. The metaphor of the childlike character or the inferior races justified slavery, European imperialism, and various other atrocities. From a critical left perspective, Jamie Martin, in a book that just came out, leveled a similar critique of expertise at the international level in The Meddlers. Both labels fit Tinbergen well. He was happy to draw parallels between economic policy and moral paternalism. That's sort of a nice way to illustrate this is that his wife served on the film board for a while. So she determined which films were immoral and should not be shown to the public. In my previous work, I have suggested that the humble approach of students of society provide an alternative to the economist as expert. So do more critical approaches found on the left and the right. I would like to think that there's also a possibility for an empowering or emancipatory agenda for economics. But before we get there, we must understand how a particular type of economic expertise, working in service of the government, both national and international, became so influential. We must study how it influenced the development of economics as a discipline and which state organizations and institutions have enabled it. I hope that this book provides a step in that direction.
Yes, thank you, Pete, and thank you all for inviting me to this panel. And this have the opportunity of discussing this important book, and it's great to meet Erwin in person, though through a screen for the first time, and to see again Sandra after several years. I would like in my comments to touch upon three points. This book provides so many stimuli that I could have chosen others, but these were struck me as relevant. The first one is Erwin Decker's interest in institutions, and I will discuss that as the first point. And then a second point, a larger one, I would like to discuss is the role of the technocrat and its agency in history. And finally, if I have time, I would like to discuss about the economic role of the state and what can we say, or at least a short comment we can make about that. So as far as the first point is concerned, I agree that this book, as Erwin said earlier, is really about economics as an instrument of state governance, or at least this is a very important thread that runs across the book, and I found it enormously interesting. The discussion of Tinbergen's decision models, his planning approach, and his institution building is particularly relevant to me. The role of the new organizations in as interfaces between research and policy making is important. Thinking about the role of these organizations, I think one particularly interesting aspect is the tension between the two poles of valuable and free and independent research on one side, and the relevance for policy of these institutions. And I speak about of a tension because often when the connection with political power is excessively strong, of course, independent research may suffer. At the other, at the opposite, total independence of research institutions from political power may make them irrelevant for policy making. So, reading this book and the specific case studies of these many institutions was very illuminating to me. But well, then I understand that in any case, this is, I would have wanted even more, but this is, after all, an intellectual biography of Tinbergen. So let's move to the second point, and let's look at the individual within the institutions and this specific technocrat and his vision of planning and control through his work in institutions, organizations of economic research. First, I would like to make a minor remark on the concept of technocrat, because I found myself more in agreement with Erwin in this panel presentation about Tinbergen's characterization as a technocrat than when I was reading the book. Because in the book, I noticed that Erwin tries to separate or to distinguish between Tinbergen and the typical technocrat. But I think that attempt at separating Tinbergen and the typical characterization of a technocrat is not really convincing, also because that is done in the book through the conflation of two concepts, the elite and technocracy, that are different concepts. But Decker describes the technocrats as driven by technical knowledge and the elite as driven by vision, ideals, and therefore tries to move Tinbergen more on the, let's say, the elite side than the technocracy side. I'm not convinced. I'd say that there are, well, I'm not convinced, and actually I would like to ask a question to Erin, why this resistance in recognizing the strong technocratic dimension of Tinbergen in his profession. But then, okay, this is a matter, let's say, of definition. More interesting is then how can we discuss and understand the role of the technocrat in 20th century political economy? And as far as I understood, it seems to me that Erwin replies to respond to this question by separating the man, Tinbergen, from his technocratic garb. So Tinbergen is, as Becker said a few minutes ago, recognized by everybody as a very good person, a holy person, a saint. But in his role as a technocrat, he endorses top-down policies. He wears a laboratory coat to work on evil black magic, the evil black magic of economic expertise. And again, I'm not convinced. And I was thinking about this while reading the book, and I found a very, I think, a relevant example in Tinbergen's passive stance in the face of Nazism during World War II. Because in those years, he maintained good relations with the Nazis. He kept his prominent role at the Bureau of Statistics. He continued to publish in scholarly journals that were controlled by Nazi bureaucracy or scholarship, I don't know how to call it. And in 1944, I'm not saying, I'm taking this information from the book. It is Decker who writes this. In 1944, Tinbergen wrote a book on national responses to the Great Depression, and in his analysis of Germany, he managed to discuss Germany's economic policies, I'm quoting, without a single word about the massive mobilization and war industry of the 30s, end quote. And Erwin describes very well the coupling, this is a word that he uses, of the economy from other domains in Tinbergen's professional trajectory. And Tinbergen increasingly presented himself as the apolitical expert, untouched by ideological divisions. I think this part of the analysis in Decker's book is really very, very well done, very interesting, we can really follow the transition, the growing, the increase in the coupling. But again, it seems to me that Decker separates the individual from the technocratic garb in a way that already said, but it's not entirely convincing to me. I'm quoting now from page 210 of the book. A focus on Tinbergen's involvement in the war, the compromises he was forced to make, and the dubious choices he made quickly loses sight of the bigger story. That bigger story is the fact that the war, if anything, accelerated the development of the state as the active manager of the economy and the quantitative economist as the ultimate expert. And of course, I totally agree with this reading of the context. The war economy meant increasing planning, state control, routinization of a number of processes, and that meant the growing need for the experts. So war mobilization was there, the expert was needed, and the expert was born. But at the same time, the expert, and this is my criticism, emerged as a self-proclaimed apolitical, non-partisan, non-ideological figure precisely by deciding, in this case himself, that political considerations could be removed from scientific analysis. And this may have been convenient, but it is not realistic, because it is not possible to discuss Germany's economic growth in the 30s without an analysis of war mobilization. In conclusion, also this apolitical stance is not credible for other reasons. First of all, apolitical expertise has direct political repercussions. And also, self-proclaimed apolitical expertise tips the scale of political debate by delegitimizing specifically and explicitly political claims in the name of an allegedly superior technical neutrality. So in conclusion, I think it is not possible to separate the man or the holy soul of the man, of the individual, from his technocratic coat and manipulation of the black magic. And I come to one of the points, I'm coming to my third point, the economic role of the state, if we can say something about that. And I'm connecting to a point that Decker raised in his introductory remarks. He said, okay, so if it is not the fault of the individual, the fault is with the black magic itself. The fault is in the role of economics as an instrument for state governance and the consequences that often have been authoritarian and have been harmful to the life of people. And one example that Decker made is that of development economics. He said in his remarks that it is well established that early development economics was ineffective and increased economic inequality. I find this difficult to endorse, not because there are not examples of increasing inequality and modernizing project gone totally wrong, but the more I study the history of development economics, the more I see a very nuanced picture in which conclusions can be reached only through specific and contextual analysis of development policies, of debates in development economics, and so on. And as for inequality, surely there are scholars that have emphasized how policies typical of early development economics, such as import substitution, have been harmful for economic growth of countries. Jeffrey Williamson has been has worked a lot on these and on the increase of inequality at the global level because of that kind of policies. But at the same time, for every Jeffrey Williamson, more or less, there is a Branko Milanovic who would argue exactly the opposite, showing how between the late 40s and the 60s, that is the very period of early development economics, global inequality has decreased, and the economic growth of less developed regions was faster than it has been later. So this is just to say, I'm not sure we could say with this level of generalization that is well established. But this variety of results, at least from my studies, appears not only with regard to economic performance, but also with regard to the role of government. Because again, we have a lot of examples of authoritarian government in the name of development and progress and modernization. Decker made two very good examples in his remarks now, and we have a huge literature about the modernist state and its authoritarian drifts. At the same time, there is an important line of research that, though less bombastic, on the disruptions created by the modernist state, shows also good government processes. I mean, the development of I have in mind a book by Judith Tendler, Good Government in the Tropics, that again, through detailed analysis of processes of policy making, shows how it is possible to create political communities in which the role of government doesn't take an authoritarian bend. So this is just to say I would be less. I found it difficult to endorse that. And again, in any case, my main point is that if it is not, at the same time, it is not possible to separate the individual from the technocrat, and therefore put all the fault on technocratic policies without looking at the individual embodying them. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I have to say that I was delighted both to be invited but also to read this book. It's a wonderful book. It's filled with historical detail. It contextualizes Jan Tinbergen's thought and more his actions. It's as much about, and I'm sure you realize this from listening to Erwin's remarks, about what Tinbergen did as what he wrote. And it's unusual for us to learn about an economist who was both so important to our thought and so steeped in action. So we should all thank Erwin for his painstaking and highly original work. He argues convincingly, and here my remarks will complement those by Michaela, and it's wonderful to see you on the screen, Lasovich, that Tinbergen's major accomplishment was to develop a modern expertise in service to the state and to be a modern expert in service to the state. Tinbergen gave a sense of urgency to policy issues. He talks about, in the 1930s, mathematics and statistics, and this is from Decker's book, in service to business cycle research. And then by the 1940s, this becomes mathematics, statistics, and business cycle research in service of the state. Decker argues forcefully that Tinbergen combined both political ideals and goals with scientific means. His use of data and modeling wasn't for the sake of modeling in and of itself, but in service to a goal, as, for instance, stability of the economy, which Decker writes about. And perhaps it won't surprise you if you are familiar with Puritan Levy and our work on experts. This is where I want to focus my remarks. I want to explore three questions in the time that I have left. The first is perhaps less central to the full book, but I think still important, and then the next two are quite central. First, Decker contrasts Tinbergen's notion of economics as a science in service to the state to that of the marginalists. This comes early in the book. And I'm not sure about that purported contrast. It came out less in your remarks today, but I just wanted to add that, for instance, William Stanley Jevons saw economics as a means to, as he put it, ending the deep and hopeless poverty in the mass of people. And his works, even in the theory of political economy, are informed by that goal. Poor people are to be taught to save more, to marry later in life, to reduce the number of children, to work more, and so on. And his books, The Methods of Social Reform, published posthumously, and The State in Relation to Labor, are in service to that goal. They're to put economics in service to that goal. Jevons is, of course, representative of the Victorian era, and many later economists of his time. But he sounds very much like Tinbergen's mentor, who, as Decker tells us early in the book, wrote, quote, "There's a field where you can work for the betterment of humankind. In the circles where you work, there is a great need for good leaders." I think the issue of good leaders versus leaders who work within constraints to do good things is insufficiently appreciated both by Tinbergen and his mentor, Ehrenfest. And that leads me to my next two main points. Second, Decker talks about how Tinbergen was an idealist, and I want to suggest that this led him perhaps to neglect the complexity of what he was trying to do. And here I think my remarks will complement both what Decker said today, but also Lasovich. Not just in the simple model of the aggregate economy for which he was criticized, but also in terms of whether it is even possible to create and implement, without dancing with authoritarianism, a model in service to a goal. How is the goal to be arrived at? Is the modeler really in the model? And if so, is the modeler modeled as we model other economic actors. Is he or she self-interested, for instance? The first question, how is the goal to be arrived at, is an old one. It was raised by John Stuart Mill in his repudiation of Auguste Comte's and other socialist schemes when he wondered about how the state would settle on one single end for all if it were to direct, as he put it, all the forces of society toward, again as he put it, some one end. Mill wrote, "What a foundation for a system of political science this is. Government exists for all purposes whatever that are for man's good, and the highest and most important of these purposes is the improvement of man himself as a moral and intelligent being, which is an end not included in Monsieur Comte's category at all. The united forces of society never were, nor can be, directed toward one single end. Nor is there, so far as I can perceive, any reason for desiring that they should be. Men do not come into the world to fulfill one single end, and there is no single end which, if fulfilled, even in the most complete manner, would make them happy." This, of course, was Hayek's concern as well, and famously, he noted in The Road to Serfdom that finding a single goal is a pipe dream. He traced the 20th century search for a planning goal to Saint-Simon, not quite a colleague, but the same era as Auguste Comte. In a planned system, he wrote, all economic questions become political questions because it is no longer a question of reconciling as far as possible individual views and desires, but one of imposing, that is dancing, as I put it, with authoritarianism, a single scale of values, the social goal of which socialists, ever since the time of Saint-Simon, have been dreaming. End quote. None of this is to suggest, of course, and Decker's remarks today make this clear, that Decker is unaware of these issues. Quite the contrary, he's sensitive to the difficulties. He writes about how Tinbergen put the policymaker inside the model, but without Tinbergen fully exploring the implications of having done so. Decker talks as well about Tinbergen's lack of democratic sensibility, even though the expert is in the model. She or he's elevated above everyone else, unlike, say, in the Lucas critique where things are flattened somewhat. Decker suggests as well that Buchanan gave Tinbergen a way out of this conundrum. Using Buchanan's idea of the rules of the game, Tinbergen could then talk about changes in rules of the games which would change the structure of the economy, but changes in a simple policy, such as the interest rate or whatever, would not. He needed the policymaker inside the game and put the economist as an analyst outside the game. Decker reads Tinbergen through Buchanan's lens. But does this really give Tinbergen a way out? It would depend on how decisions are made regarding the game itself, the rules of the game. Surely, Buchanan famously talks about government by discussion and the status of the status quo. I don't see either of these developed in Tinbergen. Decker also talks about how, for Tinbergen, plans are to be coordinated through a hierarchy of planning. That's very unlike, I would say, Mill or Hayek. And still we're left with the overarching planning goal. How is that established? Non-democratically, it seems. These issues become, I would argue, and I think the book demonstrates, increasingly important as Tinbergen's career progresses. Finding the goal in the wake of a world war might be feasible if the goal is similar to the wartime goal. Planning for a small country, such as the Netherlands or mine, Canada, at least it's small in population, might seem feasible if we can get agreement amongst the people that say, order, so important to Tinbergen, is the goal. But planning for a developing country that has so many different problems, one of which is shaking off the shackles of colonial domination. Here it's not clear that the modeler has enough insight to specify the goal. And certainly, for a world federation, the idea of specifying the goal seems outside the realm of plausibility. And third, I wanted to just briefly remark on the business of where the modeler is. Decker writes about how Tinbergen places the modeler inside the model. And here I think what's lacking is the idea that the modeler, if inside the model, is as self-interested as everyone else. And here I return again to the letter from Ehrenfest to Tinbergen. If the leaders, qua the modelers, qua policymakers, are good people, then perhaps we can trust the model and trust that it'll be implemented. However, if the modelers and those who implement the model are interested in something other than the overall goal, perhaps they're not so interested in stability, they're interested in increasing the size of their area, things will diverge. They will implement something other than the recommendations Tinbergen hoped for, and we will end up with a very large public sector with graft and so on, and no real aim for example, stability, or as in development, Decker talks about state-led growth. These are issues that seem to show up, as Decker demonstrates, most significantly in Tinbergen's attempts to help developing countries. All in all, I think this is a wonderful study. It's nuanced. It doesn't shy away from difficult issues. I learned a great deal from it, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much. Erwin, would you have some comments to respond?
Yeah, let me respond to a couple of the great questions and critiques that have been raised. Perhaps to start where my talk also started, and that is this tradition of Staatswissenschaften, or the economics and service of the state, and how that contrasts to marginalism. So I fully agree that with Sandy Bird's book, and they have demonstrated very well that Jevons, in fact, fits this persona of the moralist very well. What in part my argument is, and I could not fully develop it in this book, but I hope to develop it more in a future study of this German historical school, is that this idea of economics and service of the state is a longer tradition, perhaps the really stable tradition or the real continuity that we see, and it is very much obscured by traditional tales about the marginal revolution. Because the traditional tale about the marginal revolution is that it makes economics sort of autonomous as a discipline. It gives it its own domain, which it can study, its own set of principles, which it can use to study, and most of all, its own scientific status. And that idea of an autonomous science, I think, obscures very much how much the development of actual economics remains shaped by its role as working in service of the state. And it obscures also very much how much of the legitimacy that economist has, or that economics has in modern society, actually derives from its functionality to serve as, right? So if you ask the Marion Foucault question, why is it that economists seem to be so elevated among the social sciences? The marginalist revolution answer, I think, would be, well, because it just is more of a science, right? So it's in some sense closer to physics. And my answer would be, well, it is because it has proved more willing and more capable of serving those in power, right? And those are perhaps two strongly contrasted answers now. But that is I think, the reason why I go after this marginalism story a bit, and that's not to say that this is true for the individual marginalists, but it is very much true for the historiography that economists tell of their own discipline, in which the marginal revolution is one of the moments that we pinpoint, perhaps the most important moment that we pinpoint as now economics becomes a science. And I know there's moments after this where people claim this because it's a sort of recurring claim, right? You can find it earlier, you can find it later. But I think it's a very important rhetorical strategy, and one that historians of economics have not been sufficiently critical of. Whereas I think tracing economics as working in service of the government is as important in providing legitimacy to the discipline and its elevated status. Then let me then move to one of the questions that Michela raises, because I find it so fascinating, and in fact it's one of perhaps the unresolved struggles. And right, the book is now a year out, which means that I finished it nearly 2 years ago. That's how these things go. So right, you learn more afterwards, I have found, sometimes than you do writing the book. And that is, in my concluding chapter, I try to ask whether Tinbergen had different personalities or different aspirations, and to what extent they could be reconciled, and to what extent also he had different legacies. And one of those legacies is as a kind of moral leader, or even a moral guide, right? So in the most extreme version of it that I cite in that chapter is that one of his students listed him next to Gandhi, right? Which as a thinker in the tradition of peace. But there's other examples, although they're more obscure, they haven't really found a place in the academy and so on and so forth. But this has been an important legacy of him. And it's interesting that also all his colleagues always remarked upon this. And then Michela rightfully asks, so how is it that this supposedly morally flawless, this sort of Mother Teresa of economics, came to be involved in so many projects? Then certainly Irwin is wrong in trying to say, well, he was both morally flawless and he was captured in so many of these problematic political episodes, including World War II, indeed, in which, in my own remarks, I haven't said too much about, which I essentially devote an entire chapter to figuring out his role then. And decoupling is part of that story. So it seems that Tinbergen is good at conveniently forgetting his own moral principles or setting them aside when they seem to interfere with his role as economic expert working in service of governments whose aims or whose means he doesn't seem to agree with. I guess one sort of human explanation for that would be cowardice. So I've toyed around, and I think it's even on paper in the final chapter, that he was in some sense a more fearful man than a courageous man, right? So when push came to shove, he didn't speak up in face of evil, but he sort of went along, or at least didn't directly oppose it, because the story of the Second World War, I don't think, should be read as a story of him being completely complicit. There were moments of silence, and there were moments where perhaps he didn't do what was asked of him, but he also didn't directly oppose it. So I think on a human level, that would be one explanation for it, right? He had the right moral ideals, but wasn't always able to live up to those ideals when the situation was most tense. I think the other story one could tell is one of moral corruption, right? Precisely the fact that he worked in, and that he found himself in the situations that he was in because of his role as an economic expert and as a role as a government bureaucrat, ultimately meant that he had to put his own ideals aside in order to be successful and to be influential. And I think Tinbergen certainly did this. So I think he was very acceptable, often even as a chair of a lot of the committees or as a director of many of the institutes that he was associated with, precisely because he didn't put his own moral values um, front and center when he was asked in these positions, but because he was able to present himself as a neutral expert and willing to do so, right? So, to use Michele's metaphor, right, he was willing to put on his lab coat when his lab coat was expected of him, and not his moral or his preacher gown, which he certainly, in a certain sense, had with him too, and he could do that, but he didn't do so. So, in that sense, he's sometimes been accused of political naivete or so. But I think here, in fact, he was able to understand quite well what was expected of him and was willing to play that role to a very large degree. And I think, in some sense, that should be treated as either a story of moral corruption or him working along with it. So does that fully reconcile it? I mean, that is so yeah. I find that question so difficult. It does, I think, on a broader level, show something about what what is ultimately expected of economic expertise, right? And it's that economic experts don't say something about the ends, that they don't start moral discussions, but that they calculate means, right, or calculate whatever goal is given to them, and that itself is very problematic. And I think, right, as I say in my remarks today, the fact that even Tinbergen wasn't able to stand up to it should be a very serious warning, right? Good leadership alone, as Sandy sort of I think is suggesting to us, is not good enough in that instance. You need more. So you need right, either constraints or institutional safeguards to make that function properly. Then on to Michele's argument about the early development economics, right, and whether it was actually partially successful, or whether it led to more inequality and actually failed to bring about much economic development. I mean, I think in part this is an empirical question that's hardly that we can hardly figure out completely here today. I don't think there's really a success story from these early, right? So there isn't a country that we can clearly point to and say, well, if we look at these early 20 years, then clearly it has worked in this country. So they somehow had it right in this one, and we can study why they had it right. The inequalities I referred to were actually not on the global level, although it is striking how late global inequality really started to decline, right? Essentially, for the period that Tinbergen worked between the Second World War and 1975 or so, there is in fact more divergence, it appears, in the statistics on global inequality. But the inequalities I referred to, or meant to refer to in my opening remarks, and I wasn't clear, well, more local, right? So Tinbergen in Turkey, I demonstrate, essentially propped up the economy of the cities, and did so, and by doing so alienated the people in the countryside from the project of modernization. And I think this is actually quite typical of the industrialization strategies that were pursued in the beginning, right? They singled out particular industries that were either modern or that were supposed to be the motor of economic growth. And so these particular industries benefited a great deal, and the people working in them benefited accordingly. And so in that sense, it might have increased inequalities in these countries. And at least to the development economists themselves, including Tinbergen, this was the major flaw, right? So when he started Development Decade 2 for the United Nations, he said this was the major blind spot of the policies we pursued before. So we have to change that. Then I think, then I want to move to, I think, the final thing that I should say something about now directly, and that is whether the policymaker is inside the model, right? And Sandy has said some very great things about that, right? I have tried to, I guess, problematize that notion a little bit, because Tinbergen can claim that the policymaker was in the model after the 1950s. The question then becomes: is he sufficiently in the model? Because clearly his decision-making power is in the model. And Tinbergen has very interesting ideas that he says these are decision models. You can place them everywhere. So you could also develop them at the level of an organization where some people have certain decision-making powers, and so we should model those variables as being dependent on the decision of that decision maker, and that very clearly, in some sense, puts the governors or the decision makers inside the model. But they indeed are believed to be working in the general good. And here I think actually the combination, so Michele said something about technocrats and moral elites. I think it's actually the combination that is doing the work here. So the technocrat might actually be might even be a more humble person, in the sense that it really only becomes he really is only the calculator or the technician, and it's precisely Tinbergen's combination of being a technocrat and, as I developed perhaps to a fault, from his early Christianity, his socialist, his particular brand of socialism, and then right his later moralist role, precisely believed not merely that technocracy was the way forward because it provided superior tools, but technocracy was the way forward because it could fulfill the function of both being a modernizing force as well as a moral force. And for this reason, I perhaps overemphasize almost that point, but I think it's really crucial to understand the success. These technocrats would have not been nearly as influential in the post-war state, I think, if they didn't also have a moral agenda. And it was precisely that they also had a moral agenda that made them much more persuasive than if they had none. And Tinbergen is, in that instance, a very interesting case. And I therefore think that the way he thought of himself as a moral elite, and perhaps the way that Sandy outlined that Jevons also thought of himself as a kind of moral elite or knowing, right, as a progressive, is crucial to understanding why it came to have the influence and the appeal that it had. Right, these were not nerdy calculators, but these were idealists with technical skills, and I think both are important for understanding the appeal of the program.
Erwin, if I can, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions myself. I really like the point that Sandy made about the other marginalists, because I would also point out that Pigou is very clear that economics must bear fruit. And in fact, if it doesn't serve this role that you're talking about, he would rather study religion. He actually says, I'd rather study all these other things. I wouldn't look to studying the market, for any kind of inspiration. I only do it because it must bear fruit, which relates to what Sandy was talking about from Jevons and the idea of what they're supposed to do to solve social problems. So I guess my first question, and let me just ask the questions, because I see them as connected. But I want to understand the relationship between the people who populated your first book, okay, and the people populating the second book, because both Menger and Mises use this phrase to indict the German approach as what they called it was Prussian police science. All right, that's not a non-normative assessment about what's going on. Prussian police science, so the technocrat. And on 256, when you bring up Buchanan, you also hit the nail on the head in the paragraph there of what your first students of civilization are going at there, because you point out that the technocrat knows less than what they presume they know, and the people that they're studying know more than they will ever know, which is a little different from Lucas. Because remember, the Lucas critique is just that that no agent in the economy doesn't know what the theorist knows. But the sort of, students of civilization point is that the ordinary people know more than the theorists will ever be able to know, which is why it is the looking from the inside out becomes crucial. So if you could maybe talk about that. My second comment relates more to the meta aspects of all this, which is, and I don't blame Tinbergen for this. I think he wrote a wave, but and it starts when Sandy was talking about it. Actually starts with Sidgwick probably, but there's a transformation of economics, and there's transformation of what the training of the economist is. Now, Tinbergen and the earlier ones, they had enough connection to the classicals that they thought you had to be training with a conscience. But post World War II, you have maybe training without a conscience, right? At some level. And part of what's coming back today is training with a conscience again. That's what's driving a lot of the concerns with inequality or like that. But the training's still the same. And the jobs are connected to the training. And so the question is how much of this has actually can possibly change once it's taken hold? Right? I'm going to attribute maybe the wrong person to this, but like I think it was Mark Twain said, it's really difficult to get someone to argue a position that's against their material self-interest. And one of the things we have to recognize is that the rents, by being viewed as dentists, Keynes, plumbers, Duflo, right, or these technocrats, the rents are a hell of a lot higher than us being viewed as moral philosophers who, reflect on the common woolen coat, and how it ends up on the back of the day laborer. And so, in addition to the inside out versus outside in, how much of the transformation of economics is subject to the criticism of, the expert, the humility that you point out in that passage on 256? That's the last comment I'll make related to this, and it relates to McKellar raising up the issues having to do with development. I listened to a fantastic podcast the other day with Shruti Rajagopalan and Jen Mertzisvili. Jen Mertzisvili is an expert on Afghanistan, and they were talking about recent developments in Afghanistan, not the most recent developments, but basically over the last 20 years. And are like that. And she made an interesting remark, which she didn't develop enough on, but I think it relates to your story in Turkey, which she said in economics and political economy, we talk about alienation a lot, but what we don't talk about is indignation, right? And we should actually talk a lot more about indignation, which is that when we go in and we set up these kind of things, like, for example, bias the policies towards the cities rather than the countryside, what do we leave in the countryside? We end up by leaving not alienated people, but indignant people. They're pissed off, right? They're angry about what has happened because the central controller has, in fact, pushed them aside. And I don't know really what to do. I mean, it's just a comment. It was an offhanded comment by her. But I've been thinking about it ever since, which is this issue of what are the consequences of indignation? Because again, you think about what went on in the countryside of various different development experiments over the 20th century, or for that matter, globalization and the adaptations and adjustments that are required and the people that are left behind in some of those, right? I mean, so how do we cope with that idea? And it's connected to these students of civilization and this transformation of economics. Maybe that's too much, and I apologize, but maybe if you could just think about this Prussian police science comment.
I will try to end with Prussian police science, but let me pick up the latter point in the beginning, right? Because I think Michaela brought up, right, whether early development economics was effective or not. And we can have the same debate about the Washington Consensus, right? I know that some of the people I know have papers out showing that the Washington Consensus was actually, despite popular belief, quite effective. I think what we are developing, or what some of these points bring up, is that effectiveness might be the wrong metric to look at all of this, right? And and Tinbergen was really big on effectiveness as the sort of sole measure of whether a policy worked. And that might be the one of the fundamental flaws in the project. Right. Right. People, of course, said to me, "Well, you've written about the Austrians, so we know that you're going to be critical of planning. So, right, what is there to learn from right studying one of the people who was so favorable to planning?" Well, one of the things where I certainly was radicalized is how deeply all of this development economics was tied up with colonial beliefs and uh, institutions which, in some sense, tried to perpetuate colonialism or find new forms of foreign intervention. And if we think about indignation, I think that is a very direct connection that I would make. And then it's not about whether it was effective, right? Perhaps it did give us a GDP growth of 7%, but it could still have led to very serious forms of indignation. And what my book cannot show, perhaps because of its setup, is that this was repeated, right? It was not one intervention, but it was repeated interventions. They were not consistent with each other. They sometimes pursued radically different goals. Even in Turkey in the early 1950s, right? Turkey, a lot of people don't know this, but received Marshall aid. So it had tight connections to the U.S. early on. The U.S. first pushed for open markets and agricultural trade, so it seemed to be an ally of the farmers. And then the consensus in development literature switched, and they brought in these people who were going to do industrialization, right? And the people of Turkey must have felt like guinea pigs. And I think this continues to this day with our RCT methodology, which very easily treats human subjects as material to experiment on. Right? Yeah, Steve Ziliak has a wonderful paper out showing that there's an RCT to prove that reading glasses improve literacy or improve ability to read among Chinese youngsters. And in order to test this, we also gave some people placebos. He says this is absolutely ridiculous, right? We know that reading glasses work and we shouldn't experiment this way on people. And we have done this in other ways. It leads to indignation. It might also lead to forms of envy, right? Or increase inequalities, not merely in the sense of material inequalities, but in the sense that one group is getting something for seemingly inexplicable reasons, right? And in an RCT, it's even by design inexplicable, right? Because it must be random that some group receives something and another group receives nothing. We think very little, I think, about these effects. So it might be that the moral effect of this development strategy, or the moral critique of this development strategy, is much more important than merely the effectiveness critique, right? Might actually be sometimes quite effective in trying to set out what it seeks to do, but that's a very narrow metric to evaluate whether that program did what it wants to do. Let me then turn to the students, right? I think there's one very easy connection between the two that I think is very, very telling. So one of the arguments I make is that medical metaphors were very dominant in Vienna, right? So, and that I even speculate a little bit whether the medical philosophy of therapeutic skepticism at the Vienna Medical School was somehow influential or symbolic of a broader sort of cultural atmosphere in Vienna. One of the most, I think, the best critiques that Tinbergen's development economics received is that it's only interested in cures and never in diagnosis. Now, the Viennese medical school was accused of precisely the opposite. It was only interested in diagnosis, emblematically in doing autopsy, right? So already dead bodies that cannot be healed in no any kind of way. And they said, this is most important for science, is that we do autopsies, because we can learn about the functioning of the body this way. Whereas the more practical doctor said, what are you going to do with a dead body? Focus on the living, right? This is neglect of your duty to actually care about the living people out there and to heal. And I think this is a very basic sort of philosophical outlook that is very different, where Tinbergen is very clearly with the practical doctors who seek to heal, right? And right, again, here it might be symbolic that on the same plane that he was sent out, the doctors were were also right. The actual physical doctors were also present, and that was what he was meant to do. Can we do something about that? Right? Is it too much in the material interests of economists to do this? And I think at the very least, I hope my talk today, by saying 10 times in service of the state, should make us think that we could also have our bread buttered some other way. Right? We could work in service of business, which there might be critiques of economists that they do too much of this, right? We now have prominent academic economists working at Google or Uber, and some people find that a good development, other people a very bad development, but it's clear that you can have your bread buttered elsewhere. I would hope that we could also do it for civil society organizations, or perhaps in service of society as a whole, and that you can do, of course, through economics education, but there might be other ways of doing it. But we have focused on a very particular agent that's buttering our bread, and I don't think it's necessarily the only one out there, but it has become very, very dominant. And I think that precisely that fact has shaped so much of the history of economics as a discipline, and why it's so important how they chose that one. And even in Tinbergen's case, it's very interesting that his early career choice was between working at Philips and working at the Bureau of Statistics, right? So he could have tried to do the rationalization within a company, within the competitive market space, but instead he opted to do so and found it more morally preferable and morally better to do so working in service of the state. And I think that's a very common assumption, a common belief, and perhaps one that we should challenge.
Well, I want to thank everyone. It's fantastic discussion. Congratulations again, Erwin, on this fantastic book. And thank you, Michaela and Sandra. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.